Hey guys, let's get back to the topic of elasticity. So last couple of videos we've talked about the scenario of you owning a bakery, so we'll continue with that example. So far you should understand what it means to say price elasticity of demand, both numerically, theoretically, and then also graphically how you represent a demand curve to be more elastic or less elastic, or which means inelastic. So I know last time I said that we'll be wrapping up this topic in the next video, but I was wrong. It's going to take me 2 videos to finish the topic of elasticity, so just bear with me. So going back to the same example, now in this video we're going to talk about what causes the demand curve to be elastic or inelastic, right? So we know what it means to say the demand curve is elastic or the demand curve is inelastic. Now we'll talk about what are the reasons that cause the demand curve to be one way or the other. So think about it, pause the video and think about what might make the demand curve more or less elastic, and then get back to these slides. Again, make sure you understand what it means to say that the demand curve is elastic or inelastic. So what about availability of close substitutes? So if you're buying a particular good and there are lots of substitutes available for them, do you think the demand curve is going to be very elastic or very inelastic, right? So again, if the demand curve is elastic, it means if the price changes by a little amount, you adjust your quantity by a lot. If the demand curve is inelastic, then that means if the price changes by the same amount, you do not adjust your behavior a whole lot on the vertical axis. So think about if the good you have has lots of substitutes, do you think if the price of that good goes up, you will buy a lot less of it or a very small amount less of that? All right, so hopefully you were able to guess that if there are lots of substitutes available for a good, the quantity demanded will adjust a lot, which makes the demand curve more elastic. And the other thing that will cause the demand curve to be more or less elastic is whether the good is a luxury or necessity. So if the good you're talking about is a luxury, again, think about these, and in the next few slides I'll elaborate on these. If you think a good that you're buying is a luxurious good, do you think that if the price of that good changes, you'll buy a lot less of that or a very small amount, reduction in a very small amount? And the last one is the definition of market. Is the good you're talking about, is the market very broadly defined or is it very narrowly defined? So for example, if you're comparing food versus pizza, pizza is a very narrowly defined market because it's a very specific good. Food is a very broadly defined market because there are lots of categories within food. So think about between food and pizza, which one do you think is going to have more of an elastic demand curve and which one's going to have more of an inelastic demand curve? So this is important. There are a few other factors, but we'll start with these because these are the more important ones that determine elasticity of a particular demand curve. So a demand curve is elastic, or it means that you're going to adjust your behavior a lot, or it also means the demand curve is flat if there are many close substitutes for it, or if the good is a luxury good, and lastly, if the market is very narrowly defined. Right, so you'll see some examples too, so make sure it makes sense. Between food and pizza, if you're looking at pizza and the price of pizza goes up, then you will buy a lot less of pizza versus if the price of food in general goes up, because you're not going to eat clothes, right? So if the price of food goes up, you will still eat food, but if the price of pizza goes up, you'll just buy something else. You'll buy noodles or any other kind of food. So that's the difference between narrowly and broadly defined market, and then luxurious goods as well as close substitutes. And then numerically, the number has to be less than -1. So -5, -1.9, they're all elastic demand curves. So make sure you make all these connections of what it means for a demand curve to be elastic, what the number means, what the graph means, and now what causes those lines to be less or more elastic or inelastic. All right, so then what causes the reverse is true for inelastic. The demand curve tends to be inelastic if the line is very steep, which means we do not adjust quantity a lot when the price changes, when there are very few close substitutes for them, or if the good is a necessity, or if the market is very broadly defined. Right? So for example, food has a very inelastic demand curve. Pizza has a very elastic demand curve. A Ferrari will have a very elastic demand curve. A necessity like if you require a medication that's very important for you, it's going to have a very inelastic demand curve. All right, and similarly, if a good has very few substitutes for it, then it's not going to be. If the good has lots of substitutes, it's going to have a very elastic demand curve. So make sure you understand these. So in the next few slides, we'll look at a couple of examples and then make sure you're able to do it on your own. So between cereal, breakfast cereal, and sunscreen, which do you think between these two goods is going to have more of an elastic demand curve or more of an inelastic demand curve? Let's again pause the video and try to do it on your own before you see the answer. So both of these goods, if the price goes up or goes down by 20% for both of these goods, the question is, for which good would you reduce QD by more? So we know that breakfast cereal, you have lots of substitutes, right? You can have eggs, you can have pancakes, you can have bread, you can have lots of other things if you're not being able to buy breakfast cereal. But sunscreen, there aren't too many good substitutes. If you're going to the beach and you're going to a sunny place and you need sunscreen, there aren't too many good substitutes. So the price of both goods rise by the same amount, you'll buy a lot less of breakfast cereal versus sunscreen. All right, that's because if a good has very few substitutes, it's going to be more inelastic versus if a good has lots of substitutes. Let's do another example, blue jeans versus clothing. Again, pause and come back if you want to try to do it on your own. Blue jeans has lots of substitutes. It's a very narrowly defined market. Clothes is a very broadly defined market. So you should be able to guess that clothing is going to have a very inelastic demand curve and blue jeans is going to have a very elastic demand curve. All right, so because it's a narrowly defined market, you can wear shorts, you can wear khakis, you can wear other colored jeans, you can wear anything else. But for clothing, there aren't too many substitutes. It's a very broadly defined market. So that's, again, if a good is very narrowly defined, then the demand curve is going to be very elastic versus if it's a very broadly defined market. And then the last example is, a Caribbean cruise is just an example. Let's say you're going on a holiday, an expensive holiday, and insulin is a medicine you need to take if you're diabetic. So think of this as a necessity for somebody who needs insulin, and that's a luxury. Again, pause the video and this should be an easy answer for you. The goods that tend to be more luxurious are going to have a more elastic demand curve, and the goods that are going to be necessities are going to have an inelastic demand curve. So these are some of the important factors that determine whether a demand curve is elastic or inelastic. So one more thing before we wrap up this video is what can you say about the elasticity along a particular demand curve? All right, so we know that the two are very closely related, the slope of a line and the elasticity, and you'll see the equation in just a second as well. Do not confuse the slope of a demand curve, which is a constant number because it's a straight line. Elasticity is not a constant number. All right, so for example, let me just show you. So, the elasticity equation is percent change in QD divided by the percent change in price, and we did derive all of this last time. It's the change in QD divided by the change in price times the price over quantity. So this is the slope of a line, right? So when you're drawing your demand curve, change in Q over change in P is the slope or the inverse of the slope of that line, right? So one is on the x-axis, one is the vertical axis. This is just the inverse of the slope. This number changes depending on where you are. So this number remains constant whether you are here at point A or whether you're here at point B. The slope remains the same, right? Or the inverse of the slope will also remain the same. However, here the price and quantity combination are very different. This fraction is high at point A, and at B, P over Q is much smaller. So the elasticity is going to be different depending on where you are on the demand curve. So let's look at an example and then we will wrap up this video. On a linear demand curve, that's right, you know that the slope is a constant, but the elasticity is going to vary depending on what the ratio of P over Q is. Right? So I've given you the answer here. Where you have low P and high quantity, the demand curve is going to be inelastic. And where you have low quantity and high P, the demand curve is going to be more elastic. But let's convince you by looking at the graph. Let's say you have this combination of price and quantities. The slope is a constant number, but now let's try to convince you that the elasticity is not a constant number. So let's pick these 2 points. I'll explain. So these 2 points, and those 2 points. So elasticity is the percent change in Q divided by the percent change in price. So try to work this on your own. If you look at these 2 numbers, elasticity along this part of the demand curve is very elastic. Elasticity along the lower part of the demand curve is going to be inelastic. And then somewhere in the middle, it's going to be unit elastic. So typically it works out that the midpoint in that line, you're going to have your demand curve to be unit elastic. And then the further out you go out on the quantity axis, the demand curve is going to be inelastic. And the further you go towards the price axis, the demand curve is going to be more elastic. And the point is because the ratio P over Q changes depending on where you are. So make sure, this might seem trivial, the difference between elasticity and slope, but it is a fairly important thing that students often get confused. So in this video, you make sure you understand what causes the demand curve to be more elastic or more inelastic, and what are those factors, and then also how you represent elasticity along the linear demand curve, where it's in one area it's more elastic and in the other area is more inelastic. So the next video, we will get to the topic that I've been saying, which is how does revenue change when you change prices based on elasticity, and then that will, and I promise you I've been saying this for the last couple of videos, that will conclude the topic of elasticity.